lessons. Wanted to start with the lessons that you had, which I agreed with. Didn't disagree. The first lesson, I think, is hugely important. Comes to us from James. The importance of indigenous and African civilizations before this whole process of Latin America got started. I think that's a pretty huge lesson. Should probably have known this already before you took the class, but if you didn't, I'm glad it was in the class. Second lesson, which I think Pluto expressed most distinctly, is the importance of mixture or being mestizo, mestizaje. That's really a main theme of this book, and I think of what comes to us from Latin America in colonial times. You remember one of Che Guevara's lines in the film was that people would realize that there was one mestizo race from Mexico all the way to southern Argentina or Chile. So obviously in Latin America, there was a strong indigenous presence. Some of the heartlands of core sedentary, very populated areas like the Aztec, the Maya, the Inca. And this contributed a ton to the development of what was going on. But there's also the importance of Africa. As Ryan quoted, great quote, colonial Latin America life in colonial Latin America virtually always had an African flavor. I think this is I think Josie mentioned, this is often underappreciated in many of our studies of Latin America, perhaps even by some contemporary Latin Americans, but it's a huge contribution, especially notable in places like Brazil, but really throughout the continent. Of course, we have the European contribution, and everybody knows about that, so I won't dwell on it. I probably didn't talk enough about the place that everybody was trying to get to in Europe, which is the Asian contribution. I think the book does a pretty good job. We didn't cover it a lot in class, but with voyages to the Philippines and the ways in which Spanish America extended into the Philippines. After colonial times, and in some part during, but probably after, you have other populations from Asia and Latin America. For example, the largest population of Japanese people outside of, Brazil, as I learned in cultural anthropology, outside of Japan is, and actually also the largest Middle Eastern populations outside the Middle East are in places in Latin America. So Mexico has some very famous families. One of the richest men in the world is actually of Middle Eastern descent, but Mexican, and of course Shakira, Colombian, but of Middle Eastern heritage as well. And so there's that, and also a lot of Asian people were brought in as workers into the former enslaved plantations. So the importation of Chinese workers, as well as India, set from South Asia, India into some of these areas. So it creates this sort of vibrant, diverse mix, which, as we talked about, creates a different flavor or character. Pluto also emphasized the inequality here, and I think that's something that, although we often talk about mixture and mixes and diversity, we should not underestimate the colonial legacy of the haves and the have-nots, and who was on the top and who was on the bottom, and how this endures into the present. So we can't fall for the Brazilian idea of a racial democracy, because in fact, there's enormous gaps between the poor and the rich. And something that Liam pointed out, the beginnings of capitalism and industrialization. This topic is very dear to me in terms of understanding where all this stuff came from. And Liam, you added on a little extra bit. Her argument with Mickey about what? Yeah, when did that begin? I'll just leave it as a question mark, right? I mean, we can certainly see that, it may have been in 1615, but this is when the modern world begins to take shape. That's why I've been talking so much about the mines of Potosi and the Mint of Mexico producing those standardized mechanized silver coins as early as 1732, I think. The one the one lesson that I think I read the most in your essays, that is to say, it was something that came up in many of them, this idea of resilience from people who are thought to have been subdued or conquered or just forgotten, that in fact they have been resilient, did more than we thought, and talked about the idea of the long conquest, that this wasn't just a simple little thing, or the chain of conquest, that it took generations and to actually accomplish. The role of indigenous allegiances, something that Josie talked about, that people who were allied to different parts and different had their different aims fulfilled in the conquest. One of the other forms of resilience that we may not have heard about before this class is something James mentioned, these maroon communities, or communities of Africans who had who were able to get out of enslavement, out of bondage, and establish these often kind of independent or semi-autonomous communities throughout the continent, including in our own United States of America. And so there's a great quote that Ryan gave us from the very end of the book in the Latin American puzzle, that little tiny 2 pages, that Latin America developed through a combination of coercion and collaboration. So there's obviously, we talked a lot about the coercion, but also people collaborating, negotiating, resisting, being resilient. So I thought those were some great lessons. And the resilience, of course, goes into this last chapter on independence. It's messy, right? It's very complicated. It's certainly not something that comes about inevitably. They say there's no perfect recipe, comes about in different places. Of course, this is the age of various revolutions. We've talked about the US Revolution and the influence of the US Revolution, that the people in Latin America could witness that somebody had done it. Although, as we mentioned, for the Spanish, they were probably more excited because they got Florida back. What revolution was more influential than the US Revolution? The French Revolution, at least for the people in Latin America, which kind of makes sense. I think they saw themselves more aligned with the values of the French Revolution that was going on. And there was another revolution, Liam, that was even perhaps the most revolutionary of all. The Haitian Revolution. And I say the most revolutionary of all because well, it is the only example that of an enslaved population creating an independent nation and eliminating enslavement. And this would have tremendous reverberations throughout the Americas. It is perhaps the most, like I said, perhaps the most revolutionary revolution of its time. And it created, as our authors say, a fear throughout Latin America that it would be a kind of repeat of the Great Andean Rebellion of Tupac Amaru. Also got referenced in that movie by our pre-revolutionary folks. But this was, it struck, it was both inspirational for many people, and they really wanted to know about it. But for many of the elites in the Americas, this was something that had strong reverberations, including, of course, in the U.S. South. The Haitians sheltered Simon Bolivar, the person who was seen as the liberator of much of South America, the George Washington of South America, you might say. And when he was in exile, he was in Haiti. Bolivar was a very wealthy person, as we learn here, as he had inherited plantations and all. He was definitely a part of the elite. But he seems to have had contradictory attitudes toward the Haitian Revolution. He was inspired by some of their proclamations, and he did try to fulfill his promise to end enslavement, both on his own properties and as the revolution proceeded. My one my one big protest in this chapter is that they don't tell us a little bit more about the influence of Haiti on our own history in the United States, in the fact that Haiti was the reason why Napoleon was willing to sell that big tract of land so cheaply to Jefferson. And we don't learn about that usually in our own history unless you take my classes, but we don't even learn about this here. On page 312, they say Napoleon Bonaparte had come to power in France, and he soon sold Louisiana to the fledgling United States to help finance his ambitions to create a European empire. That is true, but he would not have sold it so cheaply had previously the jewel of the French colonialism. He lost Haiti, and he lost all the money generation that was possible from the colonies. And so it didn't matter to him too much to have this big tract of useless land out here. He certainly probably would have been more interested in keeping it had he been able to keep control of Saint-Domingue. So whether it's a main reason for Louisiana purchase or more radically that it never would have happened had not the Haitian Revolution occurred, I'm not sure I'd go that far, but some people have. The Haitian Revolution is hugely important because, as we learn in this book, and I think is becoming more clear, that during this time of the Americas, the whole idea of race was invented to justify the inequalities that were put into place. And so a lot of people believe that race comes before racism, but in fact, I think it's becoming more clear that it's this racist hierarchy which then creates these categories of race. And for people who had invented these racial categories and saw Black Africans as inferior, the idea that they would be able to rise up to create an independent nation. So it was said that they were incapable of governance, of self-governance, of autonomy. And so the people that the elites, they couldn't imagine this even as it was happening. In a wonderful book called Silencing the Past by one of my best graduate mentors, Michel Rolfe Trouillot, he talks about this as an unthinkable history. And in fact, that later on, that the Haitian revolutionaries were erased from history, even though they won the war and they won on the battlefield. And so Trouillot is talking here about, everybody's heard the phrase probably that history is written by the winners. But in fact, sometimes it isn't written by the winners. People might win on the ground, but get written out of history in the text. And so it's only been later on that people have recovered this history. Hugely important.